At exactly 1:53 a.m., in a call no one was supposed to hear, Stephen Miller said 4 words that would later freeze an entire congressional chamber for 367 seconds and trigger a transfer of $847,000 just 24 minutes later. But here's what should bother you more than the numbers. When confronted, he didn't deny it. If you're watching this, subscribe now. Because what follows isn't just a hearing, it's a stress test of whether the system you live under still works. This is not a normal congressional hearing. This is a moment where procedure is supposed to protect truth, and instead, it may be revealing how easily truth can be delayed, reshaped, or avoided. For the first 28 minutes, everything feels familiar. Stephen Miller sits composed, delivering answers with the precision of someone who has done this before. Policy language, statistics, structured responses designed to sound complete without actually being verifiable. Nothing breaks, nothing slips. But here's the first problem, and this is where it stops being about him and starts being about you. When a public official can speak for nearly half an hour without anchoring a single claim to something traceable, no document, no timestamp, no verifiable record, then the system isn't producing clarity. It's producing distance. Distance between what is said and what can be proven. And if that distance exists at the highest levels of government, what does that mean for everything below it? Because the law, at its core, depends on one assumption, that facts can be established, and once established, they carry weight. But what happens when facts are not denied, just never fully acknowledged? This is where the room shifts. Not with noise, but with awareness. Ted Lieu reaches for a small black device and says one sentence, "I want to play something for this committee." That's not a question. That's not a debate. That's evidence entering the room. And evidence changes everything, because unlike testimony, it doesn't rely on cooperation. It forces alignment between reality and response. The recording plays. 1:53 a.m., March 16th. A voice, clear, controlled, unmistakable. Move the money now. No documentation. Route it through the secondary account. 38 words. Now pause here, because this is where the hearing stops being political and becomes structural. If a private citizen made a call like that, and within 24 minutes, $847,000 moved through channels designed to avoid review, you wouldn't call that policy. You would call that an investigation waiting to happen. So the question isn't just what he said. The question is whether the system reacts differently depending on who says it. Because if the same action produces different consequences based on position, then the law isn't a standard. It's a variable. And that's where the unease begins to settle in. Not in the chamber, but in the mind of anyone watching. Because this isn't just about one official, one call, or one transfer. It's about whether the safeguards you assume exist, the audits, the oversight, the accountability mechanisms, are actually functioning the way you believe they are, or whether they only activate under certain conditions. And if that's true, then the real issue isn't the money. It's the gap between the system you trust and the system that actually operates behind closed doors. So ask yourself this, before we go further. If a recorded instruction, a verified timestamp, and a matching financial transfer still don't produce an immediate, clear answer, then what exactly does it take for the truth to matter? They depend on people to acknowledge them. And the moment that acknowledgement stalls, even for 12 seconds, something subtle but critical begins to fracture, not just inside that chamber, but in the perception of everyone watching. Because here is the continuation of that logic, and why it matters beyond this one exchange. When enforcement depends on cooperation, and cooperation is withheld, the system doesn't collapse immediately. It hesitates. And hesitation, at scale, is how trust erodes. Ted Lieu doesn't fill that silence. He lets it exist. That's not passive. That's strategic. Because silence, in a setting like this, becomes its own form of testimony. The cameras capture it. The stenographer records it. The public absorbs it. 12 seconds turn into something larger. Not just a pause, but a visible gap between evidence and acknowledgement. And then Stephen Miller speaks again, but not to answer. I would need to review the full context. There it is again. Context. Delay reframed as caution. But here is the next Luan GM, and why this pattern matters at a structural level. When context is used to defer recognition of a fact that has already been isolated and verified, it transforms a factual question into a procedural shield. And once that shield is accepted, even temporarily, it creates a pathway where clarity can always be postponed without technically being denied. For the viewer at home, that carries a deeper implication. Because most people don't interact with the law as an abstract concept. They experience it through outcomes, through whether a rule is enforced, through whether a violation is acknowledged. And if acknowledgement becomes optional in moments where it should be immediate, then the predictability of the system begins to weaken. Not collapse, just weaken. And that's enough. Because predictability is what makes a legal system livable. Without it, every rule starts to feel conditional. So Ted Lieu removes the last layer of distance. I'm not asking about context. I'm asking a simple yes or no question. That sentence does more than clarify intent. It exposes the structure of the exchange. Because now, there are no procedural exits left. No room to redirect, no room to reinterpret. Only recognition. Or refusal. And what follows is not an answer. It's a decision. Stephen Miller looks to his attorney. Not briefly, not instinctively, deliberately. And then, on the advice of counsel, I decline to answer. That phrase is legally familiar, technically valid, but in this context, it carries a different weight. Because here is the next Luan GM. And the explanation behind it. When a witness declines to confirm or deny a piece of authenticated evidence, the system doesn't interpret that as neutrality. It interprets it as resistance within the boundaries of the law. And resistance, when aligned with evidence, begins to shape perception. Not just of the individual, but of the framework allowing that resistance to hold. For the average American watching, this is where the shift becomes personal. Because the question is no longer about what rights a witness has. It's about how those rights interact with accountability. If the same legal protections that exist to prevent abuse can also be used to delay acknowledgement of verified facts, then the line between protection and obstruction becomes harder to see. And when that line blurs, confidence follows. Not instantly. Not dramatically, but gradually. So the room reacts. Noise, movement, interruption. But none of it changes the core reality now sitting in plain view. A recorded voice, a verified timestamp, a matching financial action, and a refusal to say yes or no. Which brings us to the next question, not for the witness, but for the system itself. If evidence can be introduced, verified, and still met with controlled silence, then what mechanism ensures that silence doesn't become a strategy rather than an exception? That question doesn't stay in the air. It settles into the structure of the hearing itself, forcing everything that follows to carry a different weight. Because once silence becomes a response, the system is no longer just evaluating facts. It's evaluating behavior under pressure. And behavior, unlike testimony, is much harder to control. Ted Lieu understands that. So he doesn't argue with the refusal. He builds around it. He introduces something else, something that doesn't rely on voice recognition, tone, or interpretation. A timeline. 1:53 a.m., the call. 2:17 a.m., the transfer. 24 minutes. $847,000 moved from a Department of Homeland Security operational account to a company with no employees, no physical address, no operational footprint. That sequence matters more than any statement. Because timelines don't speculate. They align events in a way that either holds or breaks. And here, everything holds. Which leads to the next Luangiem, and why it expands beyond this room. When independent data points, audio, timestamps, financial records, align without contradiction, the system reaches a threshold where doubt is no longer the default position. At that point, the burden shifts entirely to explanation. Not interpretation, explanation. And yet, there is still none. For a viewer watching this unfold, that absence creates a different kind of pressure. Because in everyday life, alignment like this is decisive. If your bank records match your location data, if your actions match a recorded instruction, the system doesn't pause to negotiate meaning. It moves forward. So, why is this moment different? Why does the presence of power introduce hesitation where there would normally be acceleration? That's not a rhetorical question anymore. It's a structural one. And this is where the hearing begins to expose something deeper, not just about an individual, but about the architecture of accountability itself. Ted Lieu places the documents side by side. The recording, the transfer, the timestamps. No commentary needed. Because here is the next Luangiem and the explanation behind it. When evidence becomes self-reinforcing, each piece confirming the next, the system no longer depends on persuasion. It depends on whether enforcement mechanisms are willing to act on what is already clear. That distinction matters, because a system that requires persuasion after clarity has been reached is no longer operating efficiently. It's negotiating with reality. And negotiation, at this level, carries consequences, not just for this case, but for every case that follows. Because precedent isn't only set by rulings, it's set by reactions. If a moment like this produces delay instead of resolution, it quietly establishes a new expectation, that even clear evidence may not trigger immediate accountability. For the average citizen, that expectation doesn't stay abstract. It translates into uncertainty. Uncertainty about whether rules apply consistently. Uncertainty about whether violations are treated equally. Uncertainty about whether outcomes depend more on position than on proof. And uncertainty, over time, becomes something heavier. It becomes disengagement. Because people don't lose trust in systems all at once. They lose it in moments like this, when the outcome that should feel inevitable doesn't arrive. So the hearing tightens again. Ted Lieu doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't accuse. He asks one more question. But this time, the question isn't directed at a statement. It's directed at time itself. 24 minutes after that call, $847,000 moved. Can you explain that sequence? Not deny. Not interpret. Explain. And this is where the system reaches another critical edge. Because explanation requires coherence. It requires connecting cause and effect in a way that holds under scrutiny. But when the prior response has already shifted from memory to context to refusal, coherence becomes harder to construct. And here is the final Luangiem for this phase. When a witness cannot move from denial to explanation, because denial never occurred, the system is left with a gap that cannot be filled by procedure alone. That gap is where perception solidifies, not in what was proven, but in what was never answered. And once that perception sets in, it raises a final, unavoidable tension. If the system can assemble the truth piece by piece, but cannot compel it to be acknowledged in real time, then where, exactly, does accountability begin? And who decides when it's enough? And that's where everything changes, because at this point, the hearing is no longer building toward a conclusion. It has already arrived at one. Not through a confession, not through an admission, but through accumulation. Because when evidence aligns, when timelines hold, when responses collapse into silence, the system doesn't need a declaration to recognize what it's looking at. It needs a threshold. And that threshold has already been crossed. Ted Lieu doesn't press harder. He doesn't escalate the tone. He does something far more decisive. He introduces the second call. 3:47 a.m. Same night. Same voice. Different instruction. Confirm the transfer went through. Delete the call logs. As far as anyone is concerned, we never spoke tonight. No ambiguity left. No structural gaps. Because now, the sequence isn't just about action, it's about concealment. And this is where the entire framework shifts from questionable behavior to something far more serious. Here is the next Luangiem, and why it cuts deeper than anything before it. When an action is followed by an instruction to erase its trace, the system is no longer dealing with irregularity. It is confronting intent. Intent to avoid detection. Intent to bypass oversight. Intent to operate outside the mechanisms designed to ensure accountability. For anyone watching, this is the moment where the story stops being about complexity. Because complexity can be explained. But concealment has only one function. And that function is to prevent the truth from being seen in the first place. So the hearing reaches its most uncomfortable state. Not conflict, not chaos, but clarity without cooperation. Stephen Miller sits there, and the room begins to measure something it wasn't designed to measure. Time. Not procedural time. Not speaking time. Silence. 367 seconds. 6 minutes and 7 seconds where an answer could have been given, where a denial could have been issued, where an explanation, any explanation, could have altered the trajectory of what everyone was witnessing. But nothing comes. And here is the final Luangiem, and the explanation that extends beyond this room. When silence persists in the presence of aligned evidence, it doesn't function as neutrality. It becomes a form of response that the system cannot easily categorize, but the public inevitably will. Because in every other part of life, silence under direct questioning carries meaning. If you're asked to confirm your own voice, tied to your own actions, supported by verifiable data, and you choose not to answer, people draw conclusions. Not because they are told to, but because the absence of denial leaves only one direction for interpretation to move. And this is where the hearing stops belonging to the committee. It transfers to the public. Because the system can record, archive, and document, but it cannot control how people process what they've just seen. And what they've seen is this: a recorded instruction, a matching financial action, a follow-up directive to erase evidence, and a sustained refusal to acknowledge any of it. So the final question is no longer procedural. It's foundational. If a system can gather evidence this clear, but cannot produce immediate accountability in the moment, then what guarantees that accountability will arrive later? Or does it depend on pressure, visibility, and public reaction to force it into motion? Because if that's the case, then accountability is no longer automatic. It's conditional. And if it's conditional, then every citizen watching has to ask themselves something far more personal than political. Are the rules protecting you? Or are they protecting the people who know how to navigate around them? If you've stayed with this all the way through, you already understand what's at stake. So don't just watch this moment. Engage with it. Like the video. Comment what you think should happen next. Share this so it doesn't disappear into another forgotten hearing. And subscribe, because the next piece of this isn't speculation. It's the full release of what they didn't want you to hear.